There stands on the Isle of Wight, rising above the Solent's restless waters like a Mediterranean dream transplanted to English shores, a palace that holds within its sun-drenched walls one of the most extraordinary secrets of the Victorian age, not a secret of scandal or intrigue in the conventional sense, but something far more subversive, far more dangerous to the carefully constructed mythology of monarchy. The secret that behind the imperial grandeur, behind the black-clad widow of Windsor, behind the empress who ruled a quarter of the world's population, there existed a desperately private woman who craved nothing more than to hide from the very empire she commanded, and this palazzo by the sea, this Italian fantasy called Osborne House, became her refuge, her fortress, her escape from the suffocating ceremony of crown and scepter. But what price did she pay for this hiding place? What unseen hands built and maintained this illusion of domestic bliss? What darker truths lurk behind the honeyed stone facades and manicured terraces, and why, when she finally died within these walls on a cold January morning in 1901, did her own son reject this palace so completely that he gave it away to the nation rather than spend another night beneath its opulent ceilings? The story of Osborne House is not merely the story of bricks and mortar, of Italianate towers and formal gardens. It is the story of a queen who spent her entire reign performing power while yearning for privacy, a prince whose visionary architecture became his widow's mausoleum, 9 royal children who grew up in a strange hybrid world between fairy tale privilege and their father's stern pedagogical experiments, and an army of invisible servants whose backbreaking labor sustained the fantasy that royalty could live like ordinary families. It is a story of love and obsession, grief and preservation, empire and its discontents, a story that asks uncomfortable questions about the very nature of privacy in an age of increasing public scrutiny, about the sustainability of maintaining vast private estates while preaching middle-class values, about what it means when a monarch's desperate need for seclusion transforms into something that looks remarkably like abandonment of duty, and ultimately, about the strange afterlife of royal residences, those peculiar buildings that must somehow reconcile their original purpose as intensely private spaces with their destiny as public museums where thousands of strangers rifle through the most intimate details of lives long extinguished. Picture, if you will, the year 1845, and Queen Victoria, just 26 years old, already 8 years on the throne, mother to 5 children with 4 more yet to come, standing with Prince Albert on a windswept clifftop on the Isle of Wight, looking across the choppy waters of the Solent toward the great naval base at Portsmouth, and imagining something impossible. A place where she might not be Queen Victoria but simply Victoria, where her children might run free without courtiers watching their every move, where she and Albert might walk arm in arm through gardens they designed themselves, where the relentless machinery of monarchy might be held at bay by nothing more substantial than a stretch of water and the word private. And in this moment of shared dreaming, they make a decision that will shape not only their own lives but the very architecture of Victorian domesticity, the visual language of empire, and the future of the British monarchy itself. They will buy this estate. They will tear down the existing Georgian house, and they will build a palazzo, an Italian Renaissance fantasy rendered in brick and stucco, a building so audacious in its rejection of English architectural tradition that it will scandalize critics and inspire imitators across the entire British Empire, from Mumbai to Melbourne. But more than this, they will create something they have never truly possessed despite all their palaces and castles, a home. The existing house at Osborne was inadequate, a modest Georgian structure utterly unsuitable for the practical needs of a rapidly expanding royal family and completely lacking in the aesthetic vision that Prince Albert, product of German principalities and student of Italian art, carried in his highly educated mind. More importantly, the old house could not embody the philosophy of domestic life that Albert was determined to impose on his family and, through them, on the nation, a philosophy that combined romantic love between husband and wife with rigid moral propriety, that celebrated childhood innocence while subjecting children to rigorous educational discipline, that praised simple pleasures while requiring an army of servants to make those pleasures possible, that spoke endlessly of privacy while understanding that royalty could never truly be private, that every gesture would be observed, every choice interpreted as a moral lesson for the entire nation. What Albert envisioned, and what the master builder Thomas Cubitt would realize between 1845 and 1851, was nothing less than a new kind of royal residence, one that looked backward to the Renaissance princes of Italy while simultaneously pointing forward to a modern understanding of domestic space, with clear separation between family rooms and state apartments, between upstairs and downstairs, between the machinery of daily life and the performance of royal status. But this architectural innovation would come at a cost, both financial and human, that the sunny facades and elegant interiors worked desperately to conceal. The construction of Osborne House presented formidable challenges that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with the brutal realities of building in mid-19th century Britain, with labor practices that treated working men as expendable resources, with supply chains that stretched across oceans to bring marble from Italy and timber from the Baltic, with engineering problems that required innovative solutions precisely because Albert had chosen a site that was, from a practical standpoint, nearly impossible. The ground was unstable, the approaches difficult, the logistics of transporting materials across water and up steep hillsides nightmarishly complex, yet Albert, working in close collaboration with Gilded, one of the great builder-entrepreneurs of the Victorian age, insisted that nothing was impossible if properly planned, properly funded, properly executed. Thomas Gilded was not an architect in the traditional sense but something more powerful in the industrial age, a building contractor who controlled every aspect of the construction process, who employed his own craftsmen, operated his own brick kilns, maintained his own timber yards, and could therefore promise not only quality but speed and cost control, precisely the attributes that appealed to Albert's methodical German mind. Together, they designed a building in 3 parts, the pavilion for the royal family's private apartments, the main wing for guest rooms and household offices, and the household wing for servants' quarters and kitchens, all unified by a consistent Italianate style featuring twin towers reminiscent of Italian campaniles, elegant loggias opening onto terraces, tall windows flooding rooms with light, and that distinctive warm golden color achieved not through expensive stone but through the clever application of cement render over local brick, making Osborne look as if it had been carved from the golden limestone of Florence rather than built from the humbler materials of industrial England. What was the true cost of this construction? The pavilion alone was contracted at £15,000, a substantial sum but not extraordinary for a building of its size and quality, yet this figure conceals as much as it reveals, for what about the cost of the land acquisition, the demolition of the existing structures, the creation of the terraces and formal gardens, the construction of the stables and outbuildings, the installation of the most modern conveniences including bathrooms with running water, a luxury even in royal circles, and the constant modifications and additions that continued throughout the 1840s and 1850s as the family grew and Albert's ambitions expanded? More importantly, what about the human cost, the uncounted injuries and deaths among the laborers who hauled stone and mixed mortar, who climbed scaffolding in all weathers, who breathed stone dust that would shorten their lives by decades, who lived in rough temporary shelters while building a palace for those who would never know their names? We have no comprehensive record of these costs because they were not the kind of costs that interested record keepers, they did not appear in royal account books, they were externalized onto the bodies of working men whose families received no compensation when accident or illness struck, they were simply the invisible price that Victorian society accepted for the visible grandeur it craved. The house that emerged from 6 years of intensive construction was a revelation, something genuinely new in British royal architecture, combining the formal grandeur necessary for a monarch who must entertain prime ministers and foreign royalty with an emphasis on family comfort that was almost unprecedented, and at its heart was a suite of rooms that embodied Albert and Victoria's romantic vision of married love, their private sitting room where they could work side by side at matching desks, their dressing rooms opening onto a shared bedroom, itself a progressive arrangement in an age when aristocratic couples typically maintained separate bedrooms, and a series of interconnected spaces that allowed them to move through their private day protected from the gaze of even their closest attendants. The public rooms were equally impressive but served a different purpose. The grand drawing room with its elaborate ceiling and gilt furniture where Victoria could receive ministers and sign state papers, the equally magnificent dining room where formal dinners reinforced the social hierarchies of the Victorian court, the billiard room where gentlemen could retire after dinner to smoke and talk politics while ladies withdrew to other spaces, all these rooms performed the essential royal function of making power visible, making it architectural, making it seem natural and inevitable that some people lived in such spaces while others scrubbed the floors and hauled the coal that heated them. But the true architectural innovation of Osborne, the feature that would influence domestic design throughout the British Empire, was the terrace, that sun-drenched platform extending from the pavilion toward the sea, Italian in inspiration but adapted to English use, where the royal family could take the air, where children could play within sight of their parents, where the Queen herself could sit and paint watercolors or write letters or simply gaze at the Solent and imagine, for a few precious moments, that she was not the ruler of an empire but simply a woman enjoying the view from her own garden, and this space, neither fully indoors nor fully outdoors, neither public nor entirely private, captured something essential about Victoria and Albert's vision of modern domesticity: controlled freedom, supervised informality, the appearance of naturalness achieved through meticulous design. The grounds at Osborne were as carefully planned as the house itself, with formal Italianate terraces descending toward the sea, woodland walks designed to provide shade and seclusion, extensive kitchen gardens to supply the household with fresh produce, a model farm where Albert could indulge his passionate interest in agricultural improvement and scientific forestry, and, most remarkably, a private beach where the royal family could bathe, Victoria using a wheeled bathing machine that would preserve her modesty while allowing her to enter the water, an activity that was, by the standards of the time, almost shockingly informal and physical for a ruling monarch, yet it was precisely this combination of grandeur and informality that made Osborne unique, a place where majesty and domesticity could coexist, where the Queen of England could also be a wife and mother, where the performance of royalty could temporarily give way to what Victoria desperately wanted to believe was authentic family life. But was it authentic? Could it ever be authentic when maintained by a hidden army of servants, when every meal appeared as if by magic, every room was cleaned while the family slept, every convenience was provided by hands that must remain invisible to preserve the illusion of effortless gentility? The servant population at Osborne varied with the seasons and the size of the house parties, but during the family's residence, there might be 60 to 80 staff members, divided into rigid hierarchies that reflected and reinforced the class structure of Victorian Britain. The upper servants including the house steward, the housekeeper, the Queen's dresser, Victoria's and Albert's personal attendants, who occupied an ambiguous social position, neither family nor ordinary servants, privy to intimate family moments yet always aware of the unbridgeable gulf between themselves and their employers, the middle ranks of footmen, kitchen staff, laundry maids, who worked long hours at specialized tasks and had limited interaction with the royal family, and the lowest tier of scullery maids, hallboys, outdoor staff, who performed the hardest physical labor for the lowest wages and who were barely visible even to the other servants, let alone to the family whose comfort depended on their work. These servants lived in the household wing, in rooms that were clean and adequate by the standards of the time but utterly Spartan compared to the gilded luxury of the state apartments. They rose before dawn to light fires and carry hot water. They worked through the day at tasks that were repetitive, exhausting, physically demanding, and they were subject to discipline that could be harsh and dismissal that could be summary. And all of this was considered normal, natural, the way things simply were and must always be, for without the rigid maintenance of social hierarchy, how could society function, how could order be preserved, how could the deserving be distinguished from the undeserving? Victoria herself had contradictory attitudes toward her servants. She could be genuinely kind and even affectionate toward certain favored individuals, particularly those who served her for many years, yet she also took for granted a system that treated human beings as instruments for the comfort of their betters. She never questioned the fundamental injustice of a world where some people lived in marble-floored luxury while others slept in attic dormitories and worked until their bodies broke. She believed sincerely that the class system was ordained by God and that disruption of it would lead to chaos and revolution, and this belief allowed her to enjoy the paradise that Albert had created at Osborne without being troubled by the suffering that sustained it. Between 1845 and 1861, Osborne House witnessed what Victoria would later describe as the happiest years of her life, 16 years when the family was growing, when Albert's vision for their children's education was being realized in the purpose-built Swiss cottage where princes and princesses learned to cook and garden and manage money, when royal house parties brought the great and powerful to the Isle of Wight to admire the Queen's domestic arrangements and by extension to affirm the values That those arrangements represented moral propriety, conjugal love, parental authority, respect for education and culture, all the Victorian virtues that the royal family was supposed to embody and model for the nation. The Swiss cottage itself deserves particular attention because it reveals so much about Albert's educational philosophy and its inherent contradictions. Built in 1854 in a secluded part of the grounds, this charming Alpine-style chalet was designed as a place where the royal children could engage in practical activities, cooking, woodworking, gardening, that would, in Albert's earnest belief, teach them the value of labor and money, prepare them to understand the lives of their future subjects, and counteract the corrupting effects of unlimited privilege. Yet even as the children played at being ordinary, even as they tended their individual garden plots and sold their produce to their father at market prices, an army of adult servants shadowed their every move, ready to step in if real difficulty arose, ready to clean up the mess, ready to ensure that the educational exercise never became genuinely uncomfortable or truly challenging. And in this we see the fundamental impossibility of Albert's project. You cannot teach children to understand labor while protecting them from all its consequences. You cannot model middle-class domesticity while employing 80 servants. You cannot pretend that monarchy is compatible with ordinariness. Yet Albert tried, and Victoria supported him, because they both believed desperately in the importance of family, in the moral power of domestic virtue, in the possibility that royalty could be reformed from within, made more responsible, more educated, more useful, if only it embraced the right values. The children who grew up at Osborne, Victoria, the Princess Royal, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice, experienced a childhood that was in many ways idyllic and in other ways oppressive, with loving parents who were also demanding taskmasters, with beautiful surroundings that were also carefully controlled educational environments, with siblings who were also rivals for parental attention, with the constant awareness that they were being raised not just as individuals but as representatives of monarchy, that their behavior would be scrutinized, their marriages would be strategic, their lives would never entirely be their own, and this combination of privilege and pressure would shape them in profound and sometimes damaging ways, producing in some cases capable and committed individuals and in others deeply troubled adults who struggled throughout their lives with the expectations placed upon them. But during these Osborne summers, they were simply children running through gardens, sailing toy boats, collecting specimens for the Natural History Museum in the Swiss cottage, and if they were happier than most royal children in history, it was because their parents genuinely loved them and genuinely believed that family life mattered more than court ceremonial, even if this belief could never be fully realized given the inescapable demands of monarchy. Then came December 14, 1861, and everything changed. Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle, most likely of typhoid fever, though the exact cause was disputed even at the time, and Victoria's world collapsed. Her grief was immediate, overwhelming, and would prove to be permanent, transforming her from a relatively accessible monarch who performed her public duties with reasonable grace into the black-clad recluse who would become known as the Widow of Windsor. But she might equally have been called the Widow of Osborne, for it was to Osborne that she fled in her grief, to Osborne that she returned again and again, seeking not comfort, for she actively refused to be comforted, but rather the opposite, a place where she could preserve her grief, where she could keep Albert's memory alive by keeping everything exactly as it had been, where she could refuse to move forward into a future that did not contain him. Victoria's mourning was extreme even by Victorian standards, which were themselves fairly extreme. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She kept Albert's rooms at Osborne and Windsor exactly as they had been at his death, with his clothes laid out and hot water brought for shaving each morning as if he might return at any moment. She commissioned countless memorials and portraits. She edited and published his speeches and writings. She consulted with what she firmly believed was his spirit, and she withdrew so completely from public life that by the late 1860s there was genuine political agitation for the abolition of the monarchy, with critics arguing that if the Queen would not perform her ceremonial duties, if she would not open Parliament, if she would not show herself to her people, then what exactly was the nation paying for? And Osborne became complicit in this withdrawal, its isolation and privacy now serving not liberation but imprisonment, its Italian sunshine now illuminating empty rooms and a grieving woman who had lost not just her husband but her purpose, for Victoria had loved being queen when Albert was beside her to advise and support her. But without him she found the role unbearable and retreated into a kind of grief that was self-indulgent, certainly, but also performative, always aware of itself as a spectacle even as it hid from spectators, always demanding that others acknowledge and accommodate her suffering even as it rejected their attempts to ease it. During these years of mourning, Osborne took on a new character. It became both shrine and prison, a place where time had stopped on December 14, 1861, and where Victoria could perform her grief away from the critical eyes of London, surrounded by servants who had known Albert and who participated in the elaborate preservation of his memory, in a house that existed to embody his vision and could therefore never be allowed to change, and this strange frozen quality would persist for the rest of Victoria's life, turning Osborne into a kind of architectural amber preserving a moment that was already past, a marriage that had ended, a vision of domestic happiness that could no longer be realized but only endlessly, obsessively remembered. Yet even in grief, Victoria remained queen, and Osborne remained a working royal residence where state papers arrived daily, where ministers made the pilgrimage to the Isle of Wight for audiences, where foreign royalty visited and had to be entertained, where the machinery of empire continued to operate even if its sovereign refused to show her face to her subjects, and as the years passed and Victoria's reign stretched on and on, she would ultimately rule for 63 years, longer than any previous British monarch. Osborne witnessed remarkable transformations. Children became adults and married and produced grandchildren. The nation shifted from mid-Victorian certainty to late Victorian anxiety about empire and its costs. Technology brought railways and telegraphs and eventually telephones. The house itself acquired more modern conveniences, and most significantly, Victoria herself gradually emerged from the deepest isolation of her mourning, not abandoning her grief but learning to function alongside it, and in this later phase of her reign, Osborne would play a new role, becoming the setting for some of the most controversial and revealing episodes of Victoria's long life. Chief among these was Victoria's relationship with Abdul Karim, the young Indian servant who arrived at court in 1887 as a Golden Jubilee gift and who rapidly became the Queen's closest companion, promoted to the position of a munshi, or teacher, instructed to teach her Urdu and about Indian affairs, elevated far above his station in a way that scandalized the court and infuriated the royal family, particularly after Albert's death, because Abdul represented everything the family found threatening. He was young while Victoria was old, he was Indian in an age of casual British racism, he was male and unmarried and handsome and spent hours alone with the widowed queen, and worst of all, he had genuine influence over her decisions, particularly regarding Indian affairs, at a time when the family was desperate to control an aging monarch whose judgment they increasingly questioned. At Osborne, away from the more rigid protocols of Windsor and Buckingham Palace, the relationship between Victoria and Abdul could be most fully expressed. They walked together in the gardens. He pushed her wheelchair along the terraces, they had long conversations about India and Islam and poetry, and Victoria, who had been proclaimed Empress of India in 1876 and took that title seriously, who had never visited India but had developed an intense romantic fascination with the subcontinent, found in Abdul something she desperately needed, someone who treated her not as an institution but as a person, who made her feel less alone, who did not remind her constantly of Albert's absence, but instead offered a different kind of companionship, less intense perhaps but more present, more engaged with her actual daily life as an aging woman rather than with her memory of her past life as a wife. The construction of the Durbar Room at Osborne between 1890 and 1891 was the architectural expression of Victoria's Indian obsession, a spectacular banqueting hall designed by Ram Singh and John Lockwood Kipling, Rudyard's father, decorated in elaborate Indo-Islamic style with intricate plasterwork, peacock motifs, rich colors, and a ceiling of breathtaking complexity. It was Victoria's attempt to bring India to Osborne, to create a space where she could entertain as Empress of India, without leaving her private refuge, but it also revealed the deep contradictions of British imperialism. Here was a room celebrating Indian art and culture within a house built on profits from an empire that systematically exploited India, designed by Indian craftsmen who were simultaneously denied political rights and treated as racial inferiors, and most telling of all, after Victoria's death, Her family immediately moved to erase Abdul's influence, burning his correspondence, sending him back to India, removing his image from photographs, trying to delete from history a relationship that had been profoundly important to the Queen herself precisely because it revealed uncomfortable truths about empire, about power, about the way racial hierarchies were constructed and maintained even within the most intimate spaces of domestic life. The final decades of Victoria's reign, the 1880s and 1890s, saw Osborne becoming increasingly identified with the Queen herself, not as the young Victoria who had built it with Albert, but as the elderly monarch, the widow of Windsor, the Empress of India, the great-grandmother of Europe, the living link to a vanishing world, and the house aged with her, becoming more cluttered, more old-fashioned, more filled with photographs and memorabilia, more resistant to change even as the world outside was changing with increasing rapidity, and visitors remarked on the strange time capsule quality of Osborne, the way it seemed stuck in the 1850s even as the 20th century approached, the way its Italianate optimism seemed increasingly at odds with late Victorian pessimism about empire and progress, and the way Victoria herself seemed less like a living monarch and more like a historical figure, an institution, the last survivor of an age that was passing away. Yet Victoria loved Osborne to the end, loved it more perhaps than Windsor or Balmoral, loved it because Albert had made it, because her children had grown up there, because it was hers in a way that the official royal residences never quite were. Windsor belonged to history, Buckingham Palace belonged to the nation, but Osborne belonged to Victoria, privately purchased with money from the sale of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, and she could do exactly as she pleased there, could refuse to update the decor, could surround herself with Albert's memory, could live in the past if that was what brought her comfort, and no one could tell her otherwise, and this proprietary feeling, this sense of Osborne as genuinely private property, would have profound consequences for the house's future. Victoria's death at Osborne on January 22, 1901, was the end of an era in multiple senses. It marked the conclusion of the Victorian age that bore her name, it represented the final moment of the house's function as a lived-in royal residence, and it precipitated a crisis about the house's future that revealed deep tensions within the royal family and within the nation's relationship to monarchy itself. Victoria died surrounded by family including her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who would succeed her as Edward VII, and her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who would lead his nation into war against Britain just 13 years later, and she died in the bedroom she had shared with Albert, overlooking the gardens they had planned together. And in her final moment she was both the most powerful woman in the world and a frail old lady of 81 who had outlived her husband by 40 years and who had spent those years trying to preserve a past that could not be preserved because time, unlike architecture, cannot be frozen, cannot be held in place, cannot be prevented from moving forward into an unknown and uncertain future. Edward VII had never liked Osborne. It reminded him too much of an unhappy childhood under Albert's stern tutelage, it represented his mother's suffocating grief and her withdrawal from public life, it embodied values of middle-class domesticity that Edward, who loved luxury and entertaining and the pleasures of Parisian society, found stultifying and boring, and so, with a decisiveness that must have brought him considerable satisfaction, he gave the house away. On his coronation day in 1902, he announced that Osborne would be given to the nation, with the state apartments open to the public and the grounds converted to uses that would benefit the country, specifically a Royal Naval College for training junior officers and a convalescent home for officers recovering from illness or injury. This decision was shocking in multiple ways. It rejected Victoria's clear wish that Osborne should remain in the family. It acknowledged implicitly that the royal family no longer needed or wanted such vast private estates. It recognized that the Victorian model of monarchy embodied by Osborne was no longer sustainable or desirable in the 20th century, and most radically, it opened to public view the private spaces of a former monarch, allowing ordinary citizens to walk through Victoria's bedroom, to see where she had eaten breakfast, to gaze at the bath where she had bathed, to examine the minutiae of her daily life, transforming the intensely private into the endlessly public in a way that would have horrified Victoria herself but that Edward recognized as necessary if monarchy was to survive in an increasingly democratic age. It must give up some of its mystery, must allow itself to be seen, must transform itself from an aloof institution into something more accessible, more human, more relevant to ordinary lives. The opening of Osborne's ground-floor state apartments to the public in 1904 was a watershed moment. For the first time, ordinary British citizens could enter a royal residence, other than the Tower of London, which was a different kind of space entirely, could see how their queen had actually lived, could measure their own homes against this standard of royal domesticity. And the response was immediate and enthusiastic. Thousands came to see Osborne, to marvel at the richness of the furnishings, to be awed by the scale, but also perhaps to feel a strange kind of kinship, for Victoria had always presented herself as devoted to family and domestic virtue, and here was the evidence that she had practiced what she preached, that she had lived in a house that was grand certainly but not impossibly vast, that was elegant but not coldly formal, that combined royal status with what could almost pass for ordinary family life, if you ignored the servants and the jewels and the fact that ministers of state made pilgrimages here to seek royal approval for their policies. The Royal Naval College at Osborne operated from 1903 to 1921, training young cadets including the future King George VI and his older brother the Prince of Wales, later briefly Edward VIII, and this use of Osborne's grounds represented a clear break with the past. What had been a private playground for royal children became a training ground for naval officers. What had been exclusive became relatively democratic, though still limited to the sons of officers and gentlemen. What had been about preserving the past became about preparing for the future, and the Naval College's closure in 1921, when training was consolidated at Dartmouth, marked another transition, leaving the question of what to do with this vast estate increasingly urgent and increasingly difficult to answer. Through the 20th century, Osborne's fortunes waxed and waned. The state apartments remained open to the public, attracting steady visitor numbers. The Swiss cottage and its museum became a popular attraction. The grounds were maintained though not with the intensive care of Victoria's day. Parts of the building served as convalescent homes as Edward had intended, but the house as a whole lacked a clear identity or purpose. It was neither quite a museum nor quite a memorial, neither living history nor pure artifact. It was simply there, increasingly shabby, increasingly neglected, a Victorian relic in a world that had moved far beyond Victoria, through 2 world wars, through the dissolution of the British Empire that Victoria had personified, through social changes that made the rigid class hierarchies embodied in Osborne's upstairs-downstairs architecture seem not just outdated but morally offensive, through the transformation of the monarchy itself into something Victoria would barely have recognized, stripped of most of its political power, stripped of much of its mystery, increasingly required to justify its existence through public service and accessibility rather than through divine right or historical tradition. The transfer of Osborne's management to English Heritage in 1986 marked the beginning of its modern incarnation as a heritage site, a place where history could be not just preserved but interpreted, where visitors could begin to ask difficult questions about the lives of servants as well as royals, about the costs of empire as well as its glories, about what it actually meant to live in this house in Victoria's time, not just for the Queen and her family but for the dozens of people who made that life possible, who cooked the meals and washed the sheets and tended the gardens and received in return wages that barely kept them alive, living conditions that were often harsh, and a social system that told them their place was fixed and immutable, ordained by God and nature, and that any attempt to rise above it was not ambition but presumption. English Heritage's stewardship has meant increasingly sophisticated interpretation. The servant quarters that were long closed to the public have been opened and explained, the machinery of daily life has been made visible, the stories of individual servants have been researched and told, the connections between Osborne and the broader patterns of Victorian domestic service have been explored, and more recently, even more difficult questions have been addressed, the house's connections to slavery through the profits that paid for it, to colonialism through the Durbar Room and Victoria's attitude toward India, to patterns of labor exploitation that we now recognize as fundamentally unjust but that Victoria's age considered natural and inevitable, and visitors today encounter a much more complex and honest Osborne than would have been possible even a generation ago. A house that does not simply celebrate Victorian grandeur but interrogates it, that asks visitors to think critically about what they are seeing, to recognize that behind every beautiful room were invisible hands that cleaned it, that behind every comfortable life was uncomfortable labor that made it possible, that the fairy tale was real but so was the hidden machinery that sustained it. The preservation challenges at Osborne have been formidable. a large building designed for constant occupation by a substantial staff deteriorates rapidly when that intensive care is withdrawn, materials decay, systems fail. The costs of maintaining historic interiors to museum standards while also making them accessible to hundreds of thousands of visitors annually are substantial, and difficult decisions must constantly be made about restoration versus preservation, about which version of the house's long history to present. The 1850s when it was new and Albert was alive, the 1890s when Victoria was elderly and the Durbar Room dominated, the Edwardian period when it became a naval college, and about how to balance the competing demands of historical accuracy, visitor experience, conservation requirements, and financial sustainability. Recent restoration work, including the major project on the lower terrace completed in 2017 at a cost of £600,000, has returned significant parts of Osborne to something approaching their Victorian glory, but this restoration raises its own questions. Is it historically honest to make Osborne look as pristine as it does, when for much of its history it would have been dirtier, more worn, more marked by daily use, and by removing all traces of age and wear? Do we create a sanitized fantasy version of the past, a kind of historical theme park where everything is too clean, too perfect, too much like a stage set rather than a place where real people actually lived? These questions have no easy answers, but they must be asked if heritage sites are to be more than mere nostalgia machines, if they are to serve the more difficult but more important function of helping us understand the past in all its complexity, not as a simpler, better time to which we should wish to return, but as a different time with its own values and contradictions, its own achievements and horrors, worthy of study precisely because it is not our time and cannot be ours, because we can never actually go back to it no matter how perfectly we restore its buildings. The legacy of Osborne House extends far beyond the building itself. It influenced architectural style throughout the British Empire, with the Osborne style of Italianate design appearing in public buildings from India to Australia to New Zealand, all copying Albert's vision and in doing so creating a visual language of empire, a way of making British power look classical, timeless, inevitable, rooted in the great civilizations of the past rather than in the military and economic domination of the present. It influenced ideas about royal domesticity, making it seem possible and even desirable for monarchs to have private lives, to be seen as devoted parents and spouses rather than as distant figures of authority, though this democratization of monarchy would eventually contribute to the tabloid intrusions and privacy scandals that plague royal families today. For once you have invited the public to care about your private life, it is very difficult to then tell them that certain areas are off limits, and it influenced Victorian middle-class domestic ideology, providing a royal seal of approval for the cult of domesticity, the separation of spheres, the idea that women's proper place was in the home even as thousands of working-class women labored in factories and fields, that children should be sheltered and educated in special protected spaces even as thousands of children worked in mines and mills, that family life was the foundation of social order even as the economic system on which that order rested systematically destroyed working-class families by forcing men, women, and children to work brutal hours for subsistence wages. Osborne House today receives approximately 250,000 visitors annually, making it one of English heritage's most popular sites, and these visitors come seeking different things. Some want simply to see a beautiful historic building and garden, to enjoy a pleasant day out, to take photographs of elegant interiors and sweeping sea views. Others come with more specific historical interests, wanting to understand Victoria's reign, to see where she lived and worked and died, to connect with a figure who dominates 19th-century history. Still others come seeking a more critical engagement, wanting to understand not just the royal family but the servants, not just the visible grandeur but the hidden labor, not just the official story but the suppressed stories, and English heritage works to serve all these audiences, to provide multiple levels of interpretation, to allow visitors to engage with Osborne at whatever level suits their interests and understanding, while gently pushing everyone toward more complex and nuanced historical thinking. What, in the end, does Osborne House reveal about Queen Victoria, about the Victorian age, about monarchy, about privacy and power? It reveals a woman who wanted desperately to hide, not from duty in the conventional sense. She worked at being queen every day of her adult life, reading dispatch boxes, meeting ministers, signing papers, but from the performative aspects of monarchy, from the endless ceremonies and presentations, from the intrusive curiosity of a public that wanted to see her and judge her and feel that they possessed some kind of relationship with her even as they could never truly know her, and Osborne was her hiding place, her refuge, the one space where she could pretend to be private even though true privacy was impossible for a monarch, even though dozens of servants observed her daily life, even though every choice she made at Osborne was reported and discussed and became part of the public discourse about what monarchy should be. It reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Victorian domesticity. The celebration of family life and private virtue depended entirely on the exploitation of servants whose own family lives were disrupted by their service, who worked long hours for low wages so that their employers could enjoy the leisure to be devoted parents and spouses, who sacrificed their own domesticity to maintain someone else's domestic ideal, and this contradiction was never acknowledged, never examined. Never troubled the conscience of people like Victoria and Albert who genuinely believed they were good employers, who could not see that the entire system was predatory, extracting the labor and health and years of working-class people to maintain an upper-class lifestyle that presented itself as morally superior precisely because of its devotion to family and domesticity. It reveals the costs of Victoria's 40-year mourning, her refusal to move beyond Albert's death, her transformation of Osborne from a home into a shrine, her insistence that nothing should change, that everything should be preserved exactly as he had left it, and while this grief was genuine and profound, it was also self-indulgent, privileged, sustained by the fact that Victoria was queen and no one could force her to behave differently. She could hide at Osborne and Windsor and Balmoral. She could refuse to open Parliament, she could withdraw from public life, she could demand that the entire nation acknowledge her grief and accommodate her mourning, and the nation did accommodate it, for decades, but at a cost to the monarchy's relationship with its people, at a cost to the political system that needed a visible monarch to legitimate its operations, at a cost to her own children who never entirely forgave her for disappearing into her grief and leaving them without the maternal attention they needed. It reveals the strange relationship between Britain and its empire, embodied in the Durbar Room where Indian craftsmen created spectacular art to glorify an empress who had never visited their country, who ruled over them through administrators who treated them as inferior beings, who took their labor and resources to enrich Britain while speaking piously about bringing civilization and Christianity to benighted lands. And Victoria genuinely believed in this imperial mission, genuinely thought that British rule was good for India, genuinely could not see the exploitation and violence and racism on which it rested, and the Durbar Room stands now as a monument to this blindness, beautiful in its craftsmanship and horrifying in its historical meaning, a testament to both artistic genius and imperial arrogance. It reveals, finally, the impossibility of privacy for public figures, particularly in the modern age. Victoria wanted Osborne to be private, wanted it to be a place where she could escape the public gaze, and for a time it served that function, but ultimately privacy for monarchs is an illusion. Everything becomes public eventually, all the letters are published, all the diaries are read, all the private spaces are open to tourists, all the secrets are revealed, and Osborne itself, which was built as a refuge from public scrutiny, became in death the ultimate public space, a place where thousands of strangers annually examine the most intimate details of Victoria's life, walk through her bedroom, stare at her bathtub, read her letters, and form their own judgments about how she lived and what kind of person she was, and there is something both inevitable and disturbing about this transformation, for Victoria would have been horrified by it, would have considered it a gross violation of privacy, yet we consider it natural, assume that public figures forfeit their right to privacy, that historical importance trumps personal dignity, that the dead have no right to control how their lives are remembered and interpreted, and perhaps we are right. Perhaps this is the price of historical significance, but it is a price that Victoria would never have willingly paid, and the irony that her precious hiding place became her most exposed space would surely have struck her as the cruelest joke of all. Walking through Osborne House today, what ghosts do we encounter? Not the literal ghosts of Victorian spiritualism that Victoria herself believed in, but the metaphorical ghosts of historical presence, the sense of lives lived and lost, of joy and grief, of power and servitude, of visible splendor and invisible labor, and these ghosts ask uncomfortable questions. What right did Victoria have to her grief when it paralyzed a nation? What right did the royal family have to such luxury when millions lived in poverty? What right did Britain have to rule a quarter of the world's population? What right do we have to judge the past by our own moral standards? What right do we have to ignore the past's moral standards when they allowed and justified horrors that we now recognize as such? And there are no easy answers to these questions, only the ongoing work of historical understanding, the recognition that the past was neither better nor worse than the present but different, operating under different assumptions, different values, different systems that must be understood on their own terms before they can be fairly judged by ours. The great lesson of Osborne House, if there is one, is not about architecture or even about Victoria, but about the nature of domestic space and its relationship to power. Every home embodies a vision of how life should be lived, makes certain ways of being easy and natural while making others difficult or impossible, rewards some behaviors while punishing others, and when that home belongs to a monarch, when it is consciously designed to model domestic virtue for an entire nation, when it is later preserved and open to the public as a lesson in history, then these embedded values become not just personal but political, not just domestic but ideological, not just about how one family lived but about how we all should live, and the question becomes whether we accept those values, whether we want to live in a world where they operate, whether the beautiful surfaces and elegant proportions can outweigh the human costs and moral compromises on which they rest. Osborne House stands today as one of the best-preserved Victorian royal residences in Britain, a place where visitors can experience something very close to what Victoria herself experienced, the light flooding through the tall windows, the views across the Solent, the magnificent collections of art and furniture, the sweep of lawn and garden down to the private beach, and this experiential preservation is valuable, allowing us to feel the texture of the past in a way that no amount of reading can quite achieve. But the danger of preservation is always that it can turn the past into heritage, sanitize it, make it safe, transform difficult history into pleasant tourism, allow us to admire the beauty while forgetting the ugliness, to enjoy the spectacle while ignoring the suffering, to learn nothing that makes us uncomfortable, to leave thinking, what a beautiful house, rather than, what a complicated, troubling, revealing place that raises profound questions about power and privacy, about domesticity and labor, about empire and its legacies, about what we choose to remember and what we prefer to forget, and the challenge for any historical site, particularly one as seductive as Osborne, is to resist that sanitization, to insist on complexity, to refuse to let visitors off easily, to make them think and question and see beyond the beautiful surfaces to the difficult realities beneath. Victoria herself would probably hate what Osborne has become, a museum, a tourist attraction, her private spaces exposed to public view, her carefully constructed domestic ideal dissected and analyzed and questioned by visitors who walk through her bedroom and judge her decorating choices and gossip about her relationships and apply 21st-century values to 19th-century lives. But this transformation was inevitable, for privacy cannot be maintained beyond death, not for public figures, not for monarchs, not for anyone whose life has historical significance, and perhaps that is as it should be. For if we are to learn from history rather than simply to venerate it, if we are to use the past to illuminate the present rather than to escape into nostalgia, then we must be willing to look unflinchingly at how people actually lived, what they believed, what they valued, what they ignored, what they perpetuated, what they failed to change even when they had the power to do so. The final irony of Osborne House is that it succeeded in its purpose far better than Victoria could have hoped and in ways she could never have imagined. She wanted it to be a hiding place, and it was. For 56 years it sheltered her from public view, allowed her to grieve in private, gave her a space that was hers, but then it became the opposite, the most exposed of spaces, the place where her private life is most fully revealed, where her domestic arrangements are most thoroughly examined, where her relationships, her values, her daily routines, her most intimate spaces are all laid bare for public scrutiny. And in this transformation from ultimate privacy to ultimate publicity lies perhaps the central truth about monarchy in the modern age. You cannot have it both ways, you cannot claim special status and demand privacy, you cannot accept the privileges of royalty and reject its burdens, you cannot hide from your people while expecting them to revere you. And Edward VII understood this when he gave Osborne to the nation, understood that monarchy must open itself to public view if it is to survive, must become accessible, must allow itself to be seen and judged and questioned, and while Victoria would have found this intolerable, while she built Osborne precisely to avoid it, the house's transformation into a public space has given it a second life, a new purpose, a continuing relevance that it would never have had if it had remained a private royal residence, empty most of the year, visited only by family members dutifully making pilgrimages, gradually decaying into picturesque ruin, forgotten by everyone except specialists in royal history, and instead it lives, it teaches, it provokes, it reveals, it asks questions that have no easy answers. And in doing all this it honors Victoria's memory better than any amount of preservation and protection ever could, for Victoria was not a simple person, was not merely the black-clad widow or the proud empress or the devoted mother, but all of these and more, contradictory and complex and fully human, and Osborne House, in its own contradictions and complexities, reflects that humanity back to us across the gulf of more than a century, and if we are willing to look closely, to question, to think critically about what we are seeing, then we might learn something not just about Victoria, not just about the Victorian age, but about ourselves, about how we live now. About the hidden costs of our own comforts, about the invisible labor that sustains our own lifestyles, about the ways we too hide from uncomfortable truths, construct comforting narratives, preserve what we want to remember and forget what we prefer not to know, and in that recognition, in that uncomfortable mirror that Osborne holds up to our own age, lies its true value and its lasting legacy.